Good morning again from Pine Hill Baptist Church. This is Pastor Major Gilbert from On the Wall Ministries here in Alta Vista. We are recording again our Sunday School Hour, and we welcome you to tune in now. Those who are waiting for our Sunday School, we are coming to you this morning with our King James version of our standard commentary, which you should be able to go along with us this morning with UMI Standard Publishing, RH Board, and there are other literatures. The standard literature that is supplied by our Union Gospel Press will not conform to our lesson this morning, but all others should be able to join in and go over our lesson with us this morning. We've got a very interesting lesson, very political lesson this morning that should be in tune with all of the things that are going on in our government, in the world that we're doing today, and we're so thankful for you tuning in. We're giving you time to check in this morning. I see a few names popping up, but I thank God for you tuning in this morning. We're coming to you out of the book of Esther, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 10. Our subject this morning is an executed scoundrel. That sounds almost like our political arena today. We got people that are operating outside of the will of God and outside of their appointment. And this lesson this morning gives us an example of what can happen when you start taking your authority in your own hands. So our lesson this morning again comes out of Esther, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 10, an executed scoundrel. Our text read this morning, so the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if I please the king, let my life be given to me at my petition, and my people at my request. And we are sold, and I, my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondman and bondwoman, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. And the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he? And thus perform to do so. And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen, and the king, arising from the banquet of the wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up and made his request in his life to Esther the queen, and for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden in the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the bed wherein Esther was. The king said, will he force the queen also before me in the house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who had spoken good of the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was pacified. So this morning in our lesson, that's our key verse this morning. That King Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, then the king's wrath was pacified. So that's our lesson this morning. We're going through our lesson aims, state how Haman's plan had backfired. Then we look at some elements on the account of more likely God's providential care for others. And then we want to look at how to repent of our sin of omission concerning the time when we should have opposed injustice but did not do so. So in our lesson today, we hopefully to glean those points. In our introduction, after serving 25 years a murder for his wife. 57-year-old Michael Morton was out of Texas prison in October 2011. And he was released, officially exonerated by DNA evidence proved that he was innocent that pointed to his crime's true perpetrator. The investigation and initial prosecution of the crime also revealed that the district attorney in the case illegally concealed evidence that pointed to Mr. Morton's innocence. And as a result, the district attorney spent time in jail himself and was stripped of his law license, and miscarriages of justice and abuses of power stir our outrage all more to involve officials who had entrusted in maintaining a just society. But today's lesson will identify a corrupt, prejudiced official whose abuse of power could have resulted in the destruction of God's covenant people. Little did this individual realize that certain Jews were in positions to foil his genocidal intent. So we are talking about leaders that are in office that misuse their power to take advantage for their own personal gain. So we could stay there for a while and look at our own current political situation, that a lot of leaders that are in leadership roles are taking their authority for their own gain rather than utilizing that to do the work that they've been called to do. So this story of Esther is one of the Old Testament that portray the success of the Israelites living in their foreign surroundings. These accounts illustrate God's care for his covenant people. They illustrate his resolve to use them as agents of influence, and even when they face opposition, criticism, and ill treatment. Esther became queen after Vashti, the previous queen, was divorced from Ahasuerus, and Ahasuerus subsequently replaced Vashti by holding a beauty pageant, which Queen Esther had won. But throughout the selection process, Mordecai forbade Esther to reveal her nationality, and she complied. There was no indication that the king himself would have held her Jewish identity against her, but perhaps Mordecai was aware of the general prejudices that are among the members of the royal court, even in the large community. And eventually the scheme to destroy the Jews materialized, and Ahasuerus, the high official, his Haman, had developed a fierce animosity for Mordecai, and they resulted in Haman seeking to the annihilation of the Jews throughout the kingdom of Persia. And Haman secured the edict from the king to able to target for this destruction without the king's knowledge. And a date of their eradication, and the Jews was found themselves in grave peril. And then Mordecai convinced Esther to be able to risk her own life, her own position, so they could save her people. And a keynote today is to appeal to consider the possibility of a divine providence was at work. So sometimes God works things in a way that we don't quite understand. He's using us in situations that we have to go through, uncomfortable situations that we go through, that sometimes that his divine providence is at work. So this possibility comes up today in our lesson, how Esther had to put her at risk, her role as being queen, and to be able to risk all that she had, not only for her life, but the life of her people. So after 3 days of fasting, Esther went into the king, and he received his mercy. And then she asked that Haman joined them at the banquet so that she could expose the whole plot that Haman had to try to kill her and her people. So that gets us into our lesson today. This was the second banquet that had been set aside by Esther to bring the king and Haman together so that she could expose the plot that he had to destroy his people. So that's our lesson today. We want to go into our verses to try to glean what we can about this executed scoundrel, how he utilized his authority to take advantage of people that could not take advantage for themselves. So our lesson starts off, it says, so the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And here again, she wanted to bring both of them, both parties, into place so that she could reveal publicly who Haman had conceived that scheme in order for to kill her and her people. And verse 2 says that, and the king said to Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. What is thy request? And it shall be performed, even half of the kingdom. So here it is, she's coming before the king. She made her petition, and the king promised her that he would give her what she requested so that she could be able to be appeased because of her continual request. See, sometimes when you, the Bible always tells us to say pray always. Always pray, because of the fact that if we come to God one time and we don't get an answer, you should be persistent to be able to come and put your request before God so that God can answer your prayer. If a problem is serious enough, it should be upon us to take it serious so that we can be able to go before God continually, pray always, so that he could answer our prayer. If it's not real serious to us, it's not serious to those that we were putting the request into. So you should go one time, two times, three times. And sometimes people say you should ask God one time and then don't worry about it. God wants to see if we're serious and if it's something that we really desire, that we will be able to go to him persistently and to ask of him the things that we desire in our heart. So we get into the third verse. It says, then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, if it please the king, let me be given me the petition and my people and my request. So Esther had drawn out the process for many days or more banquets, and the second banquet it came, and the king himself had expected the process to be drawn out a little bit more. But because of the fact that Haman had already built the gallows so that he could sacrifice Mordecai and their people so that they would be able to take care of it. So here it is, Esther was pushed by the events to be able to do things expediently because of the fact that her people and Mordecai was at risk. So she moved along, and so she didn't waste any time trying to have a multi-day event. But what she did is on the second event, she came in and she exposed and gave her request unto the king and to make sure that she could be able to push the king to do what she had requested. So in verse 4, he says that we are sold and I and my people be destroyed to be perished and slain. But if it had been sold for a bondman or bondwoman, I'd held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. She said that Esther begins to expose Haman's plot to destroy the Jews, and Haman must have been the one to connect the dots at first. And he realized that Esther at the time was a Jew. So he realized that when Esther came forth, that she must have been a Jew. So what he did was that he figured it out, and then he became curious about what she was doing. But she told the king that if I be sold as a bondman or a slave again, it'll be all right. But that's not the point. The point is that the enemy is trying to destroy us. He's trying to kill us. You know what the Bible says? He said the enemy comes what? To kill, steal, and destroy. He said, but Jesus said, but I came that you might have life and have life more abundantly. So here in our lesson, Esther might have been that she would kept silent if the economic loss was enslavement. But this was not about enslavement. This was not about money. This was about their personal lives. When our lives are at stake, leaders of our nation should not be gambling with our livelihood and our lives at stake. They should be able to do things according to what God had made them governors over in our lives. So the oppression and slavery would still have been a possibility for God to do his work. But death does not allow you an opportunity to do anything else after that. So she realized that I have to move expediently in order to get my request unto the king, because enslavement would have gave me another chance, but death would have taken all of my chances away if she had allowed Haman to go through the plot that he had planned. So again in verse 5, the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he? And thus perform his heart to do so. So some wonder why the king had not gotten the sooner of what Haman had plotted. She was a little clueless about what was going on. But in verse 6a, it said, Esther said the adversary and the enemy is the wicked Haman. King said, who is he? So here it is. Esther answered and said, it is Haman. So Esther was concerned about the king would become defensive because he was always getting a little bit too liberated with wine. And a lot of times when he got rid of Vashti, the queen, before Esther, that he was a little liberated and he moved a little quickly. But so she wanted to be patient, take her time, so that she won't catch the king off guard. So the thing is that when she became to point out that Haman was the one, she does not identify him as her personal enemy, but an adversary and an enemy of the king. So this is not a personal vendetta. This is about the enemy and the adversary of the king. Overriding the king's authority was the plot that Haman was doing, not particularly just to try to destroy the Israelites, but he was trying to take the authority away from the king. So she was making it so that her concern was to make the king understand that Haman was doing this without the king. So Esther had stated her concern with humility and deference and following the protocol that was the royal court had expected her to follow. So she followed suit in everything that she was doing, and to be able to let the king know. See, there are sometimes when you're dealing with people, you got to use tact. And it's utmost importance that we learn how to do that. You just can't rush and do things. You got to have tact. You got to approach people, even in business. You got to approach people with a certain tact. So to be able to imply some things so that they will be able to absorb and take things without getting frustrated over you and to cause to think that you're making an accusation rather than implicating themselves. So she was careful to level her accusation at Haman without implicating the king himself. Then in 6b part, that the Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. You know, Haman knows that he's exposed now. And the question is, how the king will react? How will he react? Will the king react because of his spontaneity that he usually uses, because when he dealt with Vashti, it was quick and efficient. So you got to be careful about how you deal with certain people, and you got to understand their personality. And in our introduction, part of the introduction said that Esther had been with the king long enough that she understood his ways. So you got to understand people's ways, and then that's how you can use tact to approach them to be able to carry out whatever requests that you have for them. So we're looking at it again in verse 7. It says that, and the king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, and he went out in the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make his request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So the king's blood was boiling now because of the fact that a plot has been revealed unto him by Esther, that Haman had plotted to do things without his authority, and so his blood was boiling, and he needed to clear himself. So he went out into the garden, but he had been and he wanted to go out to clear his head. So all of a sudden the king started putting things together. And Haman's now guilt was obvious to the king, and the king, highest official, had abused his royal authority. And though the king does not know why, Haman has had his own best interest not the king's in mind. I told you earlier that because of the fact that Haman was doing this for his own personal reasons, and that's why he said that he was an adversary and the enemy of the king, because he had went behind the king's back, taking his authority and using it to be able to implicate and to destroy Mordecai and the Jews. So then he comes up and he makes his request to the queen. He knows he's in trouble, so he comes to the queen Esther and he makes his plea. And he makes his plea to Esther because he cannot follow the king outside, or nor can he add guilt by fleeing. He said, I can't run, I can't hide, I can't follow the king because that would be out of protocol. So he started going into pleading now unto Esther the queen to be able to save his life. He realized that he had went too far. So when you're in life and you deal with a situation and you know when you are going too far, you have to go and do some other things. You got to try some other way or avenue different to what you've been trying. The old preacher, I was in the airport in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was writing a sermon, and it was talking about the prophet with the 400 prophets of Baal and Elijah, and he was saying that Elijah, the prophet of Baal, had tried everything. They slayed the bull, they cut the bull up, laid it upon the altar, they prayed upon it, he called upon Baal their God, and they said no, nothing, no noise, wasn't anything happening. Then Elijah called upon the God of heaven, and he burned up the altar, the water, and everything upon the altar. And the minister who met me in the airport, and while I was writing my sermon, he said, I got a good topic for you. When what you working with ain't working. See, when what you working with ain't working, you got to try something else. So there are things in life that when you're dealing with issues, you can't do what you've always been doing and expect things to happen in your life. Sometimes when what you're working with ain't working, you got to go to some other extremes. So all of a sudden, Haman realized that what he was working with wasn't working anymore. So he had to do some other extremes. So he went unto the queen and cried unto her. But then he stepped beyond his bounds. See, sometimes you can step beyond your bounds. I don't care what your position is. I don't care what authoritative positions that you have. You can step beyond your bounds. And then verse 8 tells us, then the king returned out of the palace garden in the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen upon the bed wherein Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. All of a sudden the king came outside after he had cleared his head, and when he found out, Haman had fell down beside the bed. That wasn't a bed where you sleep in. They reclined upon beds or when they ate, when they feasted with wine, and it was more like a pillow on the floor, that they didn't have chairs. So they fell, and he fell down at the foot of Esther, and he started pleading for his life. But the thing is, everything don't look like what it looked like, do it? Sometimes when the king came in and he saw Haman then fell down at the foot of Esther, he said that now will you force the queen to also before me in the house? See, sometimes you need to be careful in the house. In the house of God. I preached at Chapel Grove that we got to learn to behave ourselves, especially in the house of God. When you come into the house of God, when you come into anybody else's house, you got to respect that house. A lot of times we deal with our children. I was a child once, and I went out and did some things, and mama said that, look, you got to act like this in my house. So when you're in somebody else's house, you got to respect that house. So all of a sudden, when king came back from the outside, and there was Haman, he had laid down before the foot of Esther, pleading for his own life, but it didn't look like what it looked like. So all of a sudden the king got angered, and he said that you're going to disrespect me in my house. All of a sudden the servants came, and he covered Haman's face. And that's a sign of quieting somebody down or quieting them down in a place when they weren't worthy to be able to see the king anymore. That's a sign of shame. when they cover your face, you remember when you used to be talking when we were kids, Mama used to put your hand on top of your face. Put your hand on top of your face, hush. That means that you're in a position of shame. So he didn't afford the enemy or Haman to even try to defend himself. So when they put their hand over your face, that you're not worthy to be talking to the king, and you're not going to try to defend yourself to get you out of the situation that you're in. So Haman now realized that he was in terrible trouble. He was in terrible trouble because he had disrespected the king in his own house. He also realized that the whole plot that he had tried to plan to destroy Mordecai and the Jews had backfired. Now he was in dear trouble. So that's what made him go and plead before the king. But what he did was he disrespected the king in his own house, and now he had to face all of these circumstances and consequences. See, one thing in life is that God is a merciful God, and he will forgive you of anything that you have done. But life also demands that you have to deal with the consequences. Consequences don't go away. Forgiveness forgives you of the sin, but consequences will not go away. You got to deal with the consequences. You teenage pregnancy, God will forgive you. You got to deal with the consequences of that child, that baby that's born while you were still too young to raise a baby. Those are consequences that we got to deal with. We got to own up to our consequences when we face those difficult mistakes that we make in life. Then all of a sudden in Habanah, who was one of the chamberlain, said before the king, "Behold, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, had spoken good of the king, standeth in the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him down." All of a sudden, his plan to be able to hang Mordecai and to threaten all of the other Jews had backfired on him. I love me some color purple. Y'all know I love me color purple. And Miss Sealy said, "What you done to me, you do right back to yourself." See, a lot of times our plans to hurt other people will backfire right into our own faces. You can't plan to destroy, especially God's people. You can't come, he said, "Touch not mine anointing and do my prophet no harm." You cannot have a success when you go out and try to harm God's people. You need to be careful when you go out and try to harm God's people. But all of a sudden, what he meant for against Mordecai now become his own gallows for him to hang on himself. I remember when Joseph and his brother had sold him into slavery. And all of a sudden, Joseph said, "What you meant for evil, God meant it for good." See, what had happened is that a lot of times what you plan to do to others somehow will backfire and come back and hurt you more. So don't be so vindictive some of the times that's why God says, "Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." You don't need to be vindictive. You don't need to try to get even. You don't need to try out and to harm others when others are harming you. God got it. God will take care of all of that. So you got to put it in God's hands. So our lesson said that the king said, "Hang him thereon." And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's wrath was pacified. All of a sudden, when the king had ordered that Haman be hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, the king's wrath was pacified. He felt like now he was appeased. He was thankful that Esther had come and to expose the plan that Mordecai that abused his power and authority. You cannot take your authority that God has given you and to abuse it. That's why pastors and leaders in the church has to be very humble and have to show the same love that for those who they've been set over as God had for us by putting us in that place of authority. You can't abuse your power and take advantage of people, because you got to be careful, because what you've done to others will be done right back to you. So in our conclusion of our lesson this morning, like many people, I count the story of Esther among some of the favorites in the Bible, and through this book famously does not mention God anywhere in this text, but its twists and turns hint strongly about God's providential hand over his covenant people. For Esther's selection as queen, to Haman's execution, to the Jews' deliverance, the eyes of God clearly shows that these events, that he was there, it wasn't luck, it wasn't happenstance. God was at work throughout all of those situations. Like Esther and her relative Mordecai, we are God's imperfect servants. We are rectifying the wrongs that we have done in the world, but by going to God, asking for him, asking God to do his favor in our lives. But God can and does work through us nonetheless. We are not perfect people, but God uses us. And there are two extremes to avoid. Thinking that confronting evil is all up to us. And then also number two is thinking that confronting evil is all up to God. The proper path that we should take in this situation is depend on prayer, Bible study, and openness and understanding how the Holy Spirit is working in our lives. We must always consider the possibility that God has placed us in a situation, in a circumstance of just like times like this. We wonder why now we're people that used to call the internet evil, now we are promoting the internet every Sunday morning, trying to use what we said was evil for good. So God, what we meant for evil, God meant it for good in our lives. See, there is no guarantee that every incident in our lives that God will tie it up and make things all right. God allows us to go through things in life a lot of times to shape us and to mold us. Evil things happen sometime in life, but they're temporary. Don't think that because of bad fortune coming in your life, that's the end of it. What God is doing is God is trying to mold and shape you and to be able to help you to recognize that he is still there in his life. So throughout this lesson, we need to understand that to take accountability for the things that we do in life. So God is working things out, and he works out through evil people. He says, rain on the just and the unjust. God uses evil people sometimes. Look at Egypt went into slavery. He used the Pharaoh to shape his people. He used the Pharaoh to be able to push his people to call upon him. So God uses evil things to be able to get the good out of us so that we can understand that we need to turn to him in these trying times. Always we're quoting 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people that will call upon my name will humble themselves and turn away from their wicked ways and seek my face. He said that what? He said that you'll hear from heaven and I'll heal the land. He said that we got to turn away from our evil ways. We don't do things always according to God's will. We sometimes make mistakes, but God is still there. If we would turn and come back to him, and he'll work things out in our life. See, but with Christ working in us and through us, that we can live with the assurance that all things work together for the good of those that love the Lord. All things work together for the good. Things might look evil, but God is still working it out. God will take those things that people meant for bad, that he'll work it out for our good. So we hope that each of you have taken our lesson this morning, that God will be able to work things out when those evil people come against us, when things come our way that doesn't look right. God is going to execute his righteousness in his judgment on others. Let's put it in God's hand. Let's not try to be vindictive. Let's not try to turn against others, but let God do the work. Let him do the things that will be able to help us get through these trying times that we're in. Look at our political events that we are in today. Look at this coronavirus. God is taking things that meant for evil, but he's making it out for our good. You got to find out the good of everything that you have in your life. God is doing things, and sometimes we don't understand. We might not realize exactly what he's doing, but trust God anyway, and he will direct your path. God bless you today, and hopefully you've gleaned something out of our lesson. We tried to get through it in a rush because we got our 10 o'clock service coming up. You can join us at 10 o'clock on Facebook Live, and we're going to continue to praise God in spite of our lack of gathering. We ask you to pray for the sick, pray for those that have been contracted the virus, pray for those families that have lost loved ones, and continue to pray for our nation, from the White House to the State House. This whole world, all around us, needs prayer right now. He said that, again, that if my people that are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then turn from their wicked ways, then will they hear from heaven, and then will I heal the land. God needs for us to be able to turn to him right now. Church people, Christians, turn to him right now. Lean not unto our own understanding, but all of our ways acknowledge him, and he will direct our path. God bless you, and may heaven ever smile upon you.